Hello, welcome to week 3 of office hours. Can't believe that we're halfway through the course and I still haven't cleaned up my office. This week we're going to talk about a number of things, certainly including the kind of hard to wrap your mind around idea of not self, which I discussed in this week's lecture. But I want to start out with the arguably more important subject of my dog, Fraser. Last week, when Fraser made an appearance on office hours, and I mentioned that Fraser was a less Buddhist dog than Milo, who also made an appearance. After I said that, some students asked me to elaborate what exactly do I mean. Well, Fraser is very prone to cravings and attachments. He, for example, is very attached to the idea of taking a walk. He craves those walks. And by way of illustration, I just want to show you what happens when I ask Fraser if he wants to go for a walk. Go for a walk? Okay, then we will. Okay, so you get the picture right. I mean, Fraser just does not seem to have taken the third and fourth noble truths to heart. He's just not showing signs of letting go of that thirst that he's going to have to let go of if he wants to attain nirvana. I think also another thing that's getting in his way is he's having trouble really grasping the concept of not self, which many of us are, including me. And we're going to talk about that later. But first I want to talk about another issue that Fraser raises in that little video clip, which is that, he seems pretty joyful there. I mean, he seems happy, right? And one question that a number of students have asked, going back a couple of weeks now, is does the Buddhist path kind of, does it dampen your joys and your exhilarations? Does the equanimity it promises entail that? And I think it's a difficult question that can't easily be dismissed and assumes various forms. Here's one form that came from Rachel Imsland this was on Facebook. Does being mindful mean that one should attempt to let go of like or dislike? What about food or art? Should I start eating strictly bland food? Does being mindful mean I should avoid liking and disliking a work of visual art or music, but rather pay objective awareness and attention to what I see or hear? In that particular realm, in the realm of aesthetic appreciation, my own experience is that, if anything, that kind of appreciation is actually enhanced by mindfulness. And I'm talking mainly now about the way I've kind of, the state I've gotten into in the course of meditation retreats. And I think that's a pretty common report. Now, does that mean you shouldn't make negative judgments about, aesthetic things, music or whatever, or visual art? I guess what I would say, I don't have any strong guidance one way or the other. But I think I would say you may find that some of your grounds for judging things negatively kind of tend to evaporate. You may find that your aesthetic judgments really are more purely about aesthetics, with fewer extraneous factors kind of corrupting the judgment, so to speak. If you get like really, really super mindful and go way far down the meditation path, where again, I haven't been, except to the extent that being on a meditation retreat, kind of gives you a glimpse of that. I mean, aside from that, I do my daily meditation, but not with a kind of dedication that would entitle you to answer the kinds of questions I am now answering, even though I'm not entitled to. Okay. On the other hand, I would say that when it comes to the exhilarations, this is really the Fraser question, right? The exhilarations that you feel, are they going to be dampened if you attain the kind of equanimity that is part of the idea here? I think maybe there the answer is yes to some extent. I mean, I think good news is you'll spend less time going, oh God, everybody hates me. Bad news is, if you consider this bad news, you'll spend less time reveling in the admiration that you perceive. Oh, everyone loves me. Oh, that presentation was a triumph. I kind of think along that dimension, you will see both the highs and the lows being compressed. That's more a guess than anything else. And here I would invite reactions from people who are, who consider themselves very far along the path. There's a great thread in the discussion forum on the Coursera site called, I think, Ask the Buddhists, where a number of very serious Buddhists from different traditions have made themselves available to answer questions about Buddhism. And I'd be interested in what they have to say about these kinds of things. And there are other forms that this very kind of question can assume. And here is one of the more challenging ones. And it was put in almost identical form by Bella Kaul, Kaul, in the discussion forum, and by Anastasia Hudson on Facebook. Bella says, what about love? If we detach from the feeling of love, then are we detaching ourselves from our feelings for our children, parents, loved ones? Anastasia says, but how can one be free from attachments in love to a spouse or a kid or a relative? I think this is very hard. I mean, what seems to me to be the standard answer that you may get from a meditation teacher is, well, you can separate love from attachment. You can love without attachment. It sounds great in theory. And I think there's one sense in which it's clearly true. If by attachment you mean kind of clinging in a controlling way, certainly the kind of cliche, loving is letting go, is, I think, basically true. And it's certainly possible to love and yet give up on trying to control what the person does, the destiny, give up on trying to remake your child in your image or your mate in your image or whatever else. That's certainly possible. But a context in which this is often addressed, this issue, is I'm suffering because I'm so worried about my child or because my child is actually suffering. And I know that, and it's making me suffer. And I have heard people in response to that issue say, well, you have to separate love from attachment. Well, I would like to hear from people who have successfully done that. I have talked to people who, I won't get into that. That's too complicated. But I think it's very, very hard, and I'd like to know what exactly it would mean to manage to kind of insulate yourself from the suffering of your own child and yet love them as fully as you ever did. That seems to be challenging. Not necessarily impossible, but that's another area where I'd love to hear, I'd love to ask the Buddhists in the Ask the Buddhists discussion forum. Now, another form of this general question of don't we lose some don't we throw out some good along with the bad in the Buddhist path? Again, different forms. I should say roughly the same form of the question comes from two people, one in Facebook, one in the discussion forum. Anna Walsh-Greeny asks, if you become detached and cynical about your feelings, do you begin to lose empathy? Katharina Brugabors, whose name I think I can guarantee you I've just mispronounced, says, I understand that Buddhism does not teach to be without emotions, and so on, but then she asks, but could you describe the state of what it feels like to be compassionate but not attached? Okay, so I take these to be applying, these questions to be applying, beyond the realm of kin and loved ones, but just, they're about the question of can you feel compassion, if you're kind of far along the path, well, certainly a lot of people say they do, and it's a specific kind of emphasis in Buddhism, the cultivation of empathy and compassion. There is this thing called loving kindness meditation, or metta meditation. Metta is the Pali word for loving kindness. So it is certainly part of Buddhism to specifically cultivate that. Whether if you get really far along the path, you are not as kind of emotionally engaged in, you don't really feel the suffering of others as intensely as you might have previously. That's again a question it's a good question. I would throw it out to really serious Buddhists. But one thing, a question I would ask though of both people who like Anna and Katharina are asking about compassion is, do you feel that right now you really deploy compassion and empathy kind of evenly across humanity? Because if you do, you're doing way better than most of us. It is human nature. It is, human nature as created by natural selection to not do that and to manage to be really indifferent to the suffering of a lot of people. But certainly it is human nature. What we naturally do is focus our compassion, our empathy, more on certain kinds of people, kin, friends, and so on. So I would just suggest that, even if it turned out that you felt that there was some diminishing of the most intense empathy you feel for some people as a result of doing really, really serious meditative practice, you might find that you're also letting go of some impediments to feeling compassion and empathy more broadly for people you hadn't been feeling it for. Okay, so could be, in a certain sense, a net gain. But again, I'd like to hear what others say. Finally, along this, in this general area of do we lose some good things along with the bad things we leave behind, Carol Schatz, who's actually responding to what I quoted Rachel saying earlier. She says, she has somewhat the same question as Rachel. Today I was angry at a comment someone made about someone I like. That anger might lead me to take some action to protect that person. If I dismiss that angle or neutralize it, where does my action toward justice go? Here, I think the standard answer is that losing some of the intensity of your moral indignation, which could conceivably happen, doesn't mean losing your capacity to act skillfully, as they say, to intervene skillfully to correct injustices that you perceive. That's the standard answer. Not one I'm necessarily vouching for, but it's what is said. What I would add to that is, again, a question kind of like the one I just asked about empathy. Are you sure that right now, when you feel righteous anger on behalf of someone, that it's clear perception that is leading you to feel the righteous anger? It's interesting that you said, today I was angry at a comment someone made about someone I like. This is the standard thing for all of us, is to be most angry at affronts to people that we like or that we're related to. And certainly, I think, it is my view that we are designed by natural selection to be biased in that regard, to actually not see clearly and objectively in terms of who is in the right here and who is in the wrong when someone that we like is involved. So here again, I would say, it's possible, even if some of the intensity of your righteous indignation were lost, it may be that your actual perception of injustice is more acute and more balanced. in which case anything you do to correct it is going to be presumably, more justly oriented, I guess. Okay, now on to not self. Possibly the most difficult teaching in all of Buddhism, so it's not surprising that a lot of students were left kind of trying to make sense of it. I think Lawrence Dawson in the discussion forum gets the trophy for the most creative synthesis of two different elements of these lectures. He suggests that maybe the self that we get attached to is something that tends to be personified, analogous to the way Professor Wright personifies natural selection. It's a useful abstraction, but not something we should attach too much significance to, since it is merely an abstraction for an aggregate of aggregates, as you put it. He was responding to another commenter. The analogy with natural selection is interesting because I do think a lot of the spirit of the teaching about not self is that that what we're calling the self is very much just a process in interaction with the outside world, whereas we think of it as something almost more static and certainly more kind of substantial and kind of coherent through time, I guess. Relatedly, William Woods on Facebook said, how about instead of locating the I or self or the noun, but instead the verb? If he means to suggest that what we call the self is less like a noun, more like a verb, I think that is a good metaphor, and does capture, I think, the spirit of some of the teaching. Anonymous says the following, and by the way, who better qualified to opine on the not self doctrine than someone whose name is no name, not name. That's what anonymous means. So I think we can attach some authority to whatever anonymous says. And in fact, it's actually, it's very good what anonymous says. And to the point, I suggest that maybe the idea of self is maybe the five aggregates aren't part of our self because they aren't authentic. In other words, they're not authentic because the aggregates are quickly shaped by outside forces, other people, experiences, desires, expectations. I didn't get into this in the lectures, but this too is very much in the spirit of the Buddhist teaching. There's a great awareness of the way causes impinge on our behavior, and that's another sense in which Buddhist teaching is very kind of modern and scientific in spirit. The term conditions, as it's translated into English, is maybe not exactly what the word causes means to us, but it's close. So when you hear the emphasis on conditions, you are hearing an emphasis on the role that circumstance and causes in your environment play, and that is part of the idea here. I think that if you acknowledge how much of our behavior is just a response to what's coming in, it's like input output. You could start to ask, well, then where is the role for a truly autonomous self that's really autonomously generating stuff? It seems to be largely a kind of responsive process, like a computer program. There's inputs, there's an algorithm in there for translating inputs into outputs, but still it's the inputs causing the outputs in a sense, so why positive self in a computer? I don't want to suggest that Buddhism is entirely deterministic, that there's no role for volition or free will. I think that would be misleading. Still, there's certainly an awareness of the extent to which our behavior is caused in much the sense that a modern behavioral scientist would say it's caused. Wee Wen Hu, if I'm pronouncing that right, asks, this on Facebook, I would like to know Professor Wright's definition of self, and goes on. I just want to emphasize, my definition of self doesn't matter, and it's not that's not what I was trying to convey. I was trying to get at what the Buddha meant by self. Volumes have been written on this, so I was just kind of focusing on what we can infer from his most famous discourse on the not self about what he meant. And I said there are two properties he seems to be attaching to the self. Control, it's about control, and also about persistence through time. So those are two properties that seem to have been clearly on his mind when he talked about the self, which doesn't mean there weren't more. But again, volumes have been written about this. Now, kind of relatedly, Jennifer Hawkins in the discussion forum asks, why does the self need to have control? Can't there be a self who doesn't control the emotions it experiences? In reaction to stimuli, I guess she says, sure, you can define self any way you want. I mean, for the Buddha, it was about control. But yes, you can come up with another definition of self and argue that kind of self exists. Similarly, Kathy Peabody Ong, I think, A-N-G, says, still having trouble grasping the idea of non-self. Isn't it myself that is observing the thoughts during mindfulness meditation? Again, you can say that's myself. Maybe it's not the doer of deeds, but it's the observer. And that is something that is sometimes said in this context. There's certainly something going on. There is awareness, right? I mean, they have to, the most fervent advocate of the not-self doctrine has to concede that there is awareness. What you may hear from people who have had profound meditative experiences along this dimension is that, yes, but they also perceive that the awareness isn't really confined to their head in a certain sense. I mean, yes, that's the perspective from which they're seeing things, but they may say they now perceive that awareness is some kind of universal field or something, and this is just one point of access to it. There's various kinds of things they say, but what no one that I know of denies is the existence of awareness, and that's good. I'm in favor of awareness, and if you want to call that the self, that is a kind of self. If you want to use the term that way, that's fine. Lucy Whitehead, I think on Facebook, said, so are you saying that the self, the I, might be a story that the left side of the brain tells to itself? I didn't say that, but it's an interesting thought. I mean, I'd be a little careful about how precisely anatomical I get in designating, particular functions to parts of the brain, but certainly that is an interesting conjecture consistent with what I said in the lecture. Some people got a little freaked out by the concept of not self. I mean, like it really bothered them and made them kind of worry. I know there's one person in the discussion forum who expressed that. And there was, by the way, a really nice interaction, I thought, in response to that in the discussion forum. I mean, somebody said, well, what is it that worries you about it? And they kind of talked it through. And last time I checked, it was a very nice conversation. And I want to say in general, the tenor on the discussion forum has, I think, just been kind of wonderfully civil. I've had experience with a lot of discussion forums that were not so civil. And before I taught this course, somebody I know who had just taught a Coursera course, warned me, the commenters can be brutal. And I don't know so far what exactly he's talking about. Everybody, I mean, I haven't seen every single comment, and maybe not every single comment has been a picture of decorum, but people have been very nice to me, and so far as I can tell, they've been nice to each other. My advice to this professor is next time he teaches a course on the Coursera platform, make sure it's about Buddhism, because I think you get a particularly thoughtful, in both senses of the word, group of people in your discussion forum. Anyway, in response to people who get really troubled by the not self concept, I want to emphasize, even in according to Buddhist doctrine, the self does exist in what is called a conventional sense, or sometimes a relative sense. Its existence is denied in an ultimate sense, but it is certainly considered fine to go talking about yourself and, yes, I'll be there tomorrow, and you can say stuff like that. And in general, I wouldn't worry too much about the possibility. And again, the whole thing is so thorny, the whole issue, that I think I have to just say it's a possibility, having not myself had a profound meditative experience of not self, although I've had inklings. And by the way, we will get later in the course, we will get more testimony from kind of adept meditators about the not-self experience, in particular in Lectures 5 and Lecture 6. But anyway, what I would say is don't get too caught up in the possibility that in some ultimate sense the self doesn't exist. And in this regard, I would just point to an interesting post by Emily Holdsworth in the discussion forum. That the title of the thread she started was, "Would anyone like to have a go at explaining this concept of not self to an 8 to 12-year-olds?" And I guess she was giving some thought to doing that. Finally, after discussing this with somebody named WF, she said, maybe, you know what she should do? She said, I might want to share a bit of it, the teaching of not self. The idea that unpleasant thoughts are not permanent aspects of self in order to ease the child's mind, that they come and go and are a part of life. You know, I think that's not only a good way to approach it with 8 to 12-year-olds, but not a bad way to approach it with 12 to 99-year-olds. Especially beginning meditators and moderately serious meditators. As I tried to suggest in the second segment of this last lecture, I think a very healthy approach to the not self doctrine is just to look at it that way for now. Just like, hey, I don't have to own this particular emotion. I don't have to think of that as part of myself. Here's a practice, meditative practice that actually helps me not own these things, not cling to these things so firmly when it's not healthful to do so. Now that may lead you down a meditative path as you get better and better at letting go of more and more baggage. That may lead you down a meditative path until you get to a point where you become convinced that in some ultimate sense the self doesn't exist. And at that point, you're God bless you. That's you may be getting close to enlightenment. Certainly, you will have gotten a lot further than Fraser has gotten, which is good. But that's what that would be my advice on not self. Okay, just quickly, some questions that were left over from previous lectures by and large. So on Twitter, in response to lecture number 2, Katya Prokina wrote, I don't think it helps recognizing rage is useless from an evolutionary standpoint when you are actually in rage. I agree. Can you hear Fraser and Milo, by the way? they are enraged at this point, and they are unable to do anything about it. In any event, this is true. This is what the meditation is for. This is what the mindfulness meditation is for. I mean, evolutionary psychology is very good at highlighting absurdly counterproductive or unproductive things about us and our tendencies and our perceptions. It's not good at telling us what to do about them. That's not its job. It's science, not therapy. But I have found mindfulness meditation to be particularly well suited to that part of the job. Matthew Lindsay tweets, how can Buddhism strip away delusions caused by natural selection? Aren't they hardwired? I've never liked the term hardwired because almost nothing is truly hardwired, right? There's almost nothing we can't change through whatever therapy, pharmacology, surgery, something, right? But it's true that some of these tendencies and delusions that we're working on are deeply entrenched. Some of them are deeply entrenched and conspicuous, like rage, and some of them were still, in a way, more challenging still, are deeply entrenched and subtle. And in those cases, the mindfulness meditation is useful not just in doing something about them, but in perceiving them in the first place, becoming aware of the problem to begin with. Sartorato Diego on Facebook asks, if Buddhism is, in a sense, a rebellion against the logic of natural selection, how come the brain is wired for that subversion? How did natural selection take us to a point where we can somehow modify the standard programming of the brain? Is it an evolutionary advantage? Well, I wouldn't say it was designed by natural selection to subvert natural selection per se, but, well, let me actually just turn the floor over to another commenter. This comes from the discussion forum. Derek Newby asks, when we talk about the products of natural selection, are we including only the more primitive instincts like fear and desire that were useful in the survival of the species? Shouldn't we also include the higher order thinking capacity that has also been naturally selected and which seems to be the tool we can use to diagnose the causes of suffering and the path to alleviating it? In that sense, the products of natural selection, the things that define human nature, are both the cause of suffering and the source of our ability to rise above it. Yes, I think I would just let that stand as a reasonable, quite reasonable observation. So that's it for office hours. Week 3, we'll be back next week. I know what you're wondering. Sure, Bob will be there, but will Fraser and Milo be there? I do think there's a chance we'll see another appearance by Fraser and or Milo. So you may want to show up. Thank you.